Better ingredients, better pizza, means that each bite of this slice right here is gonna just keep getting better. From the first bite, to the spicy sausage bite, to the string of melty cheese. And then bam! You got that crispy piece, the gooey piece, that sauce, that dip. And just when you're thinking this slice cannot get any better, you get to that epic stuffed crust that's hand-stuffed.
All right, I'm back, and I got bugs. Not bed bugs though. So what I'm going to do tonight is I have a few models that have been kicking around my hard drive, sort of at a semi-finished state, and I was kind of in the mood to do some poly painting tonight. So I wanted to show some of my techniques for painting on specifically a couple of arachnid models. So this is a Pseudo Scorpion. Looks terrifying, but they're actually quite harmless. They're very small, and they use their big claws as a method of locomotion, which is very interesting. Basically what they do is they hitchhike on other flying insects or flying animals, flying birds. So they literally latch on to another bug's legs. Bug takes off, flies, and when they're flies around, and when they're ready to, it's like an Uber. They just let go, and that's how they get around. But they're very small, pretty harmless. They just look scary. They're called Pseudo Scorpions because of the big claws. So that's one that I'm going to work on painting tonight. And then another one, this is a schizomid, which is a type of arachnid. And they kind of, well, they kind of look like something between a scorpion and a spider. They're also very, very small and not very harmful. They just look scary. But what I like about these schizomids is they have a genus name of Draculoides, which I think is really cool because they have this sort of vampire quality. So like a lot of arachnids, they have chelicerae, which are these two fangs appendages right here with these fangs. Spiders have the same thing, right? And then they have pedipalps, which are these fearsome looking gravity things. They have teeth. And then they have 8 legs and an abdomen. So kind of, and I believe this is a reproductive organ, although I don't know that much about it, so I can't tell you. So I made these models a few years ago for a client, and they were printed up and made part of a museum exhibit on creepy crawly arachnids, and pretty cool. The prints are really big. So this is what I got originally from the client for the Pseudo Scorpion, so you can see it's scan data. And this one's not too bad. I had some that was much, much worse. But, you know, this is part of being a ZBrush artist. It's not always fabulous babes and robots. Sometimes you got to earn a paycheck. Of course, this is the kind of job that I really enjoy thoroughly. But I had to take this scan data along with some reference imagery and basically turn it into a model that was usable. So you could see I would cut it up into pieces and all that kind of stuff and use Dynamesh and other tools to finally end up with something that looks like this. So that's kind of where this came from. So what I usually like to do is I always do my sculpting. And if you take a look, if I switch materials, you can see that there is a fair amount of very fine detail on here that I sculpted into the surface using various noise brushes and that kind of stuff, kind of typical techniques. And I love doing this type of detailing right here, where you see cracks in the chitin, in the exoskeleton. that kind of detail is really cool. I mean, it's like from far away, this doesn't look very detailed at all. It looks pretty simple, at least compared to a lot of other models that I've done. But this detail is very fine, and when you zoom in, you can see that there's quite a lot of it. And so what I like to do is I like to create this kind of surface detail before doing any kind of painting. Now this model was for print, so I didn't really have to worry about the topology as much. So since it wasn't going to be animated, the only thing I needed to do was make sure that eventually it was going to be watertight and printable. So this is the version I did before preparing it for print. So a lot of these surfaces do have subdivisions. So for example, if I turn on the solo button, so this is the cephalothorax, or the head. So it's not a whole lot of detail, but it does have subdivisions, and kind of a typical Z-remesh topology, not super fancy but good enough. And its highest subdivision level is about 2 million, and sometimes I'll do even more than that, but I think 2 million is fine for this. Yeah, the total for the whole model, all the subtools combined, is 59 million polygons, and that's pretty typical for the models that I do. And sometimes I get them at like around 100 or so million polygons, but that's all the subtools at their highest subdivision level. So one of the great things about ZBrush is because each subtool is kind of independent. In other words, in the way that ZBrush, whatever voodoo it does, it doesn't really slow the machine down too much if your total points are really high. If I had one subtool at like 59 million, that might be a different issue. But for the total, it's not that big a deal. But this should be plenty for what I'm doing. And what I like to do is, sculpt all that detail into the surface, and then, sorry, I'm using the space mouse here, it's going a little crazy. And then I'll use that as a way to quickly add detail to the poly paint. So let's switch over to Skin Shade 4 material. I'm going to alt click on this to switch to that subtool. And let's turn on the solo button and press F. So what I want to do is let's take a look at some reference. So here's some reference for the schizomid and Pseudo Scorpions. There's lots of species of Pseudo Scorpions. And you can see there, this guy has one on his finger. So that's the scale that we're talking about. And I really love teeny weeny itty bitty organisms because they're like dinosaurs, just at a completely different scale. And in fact, they're actually wackier than dinosaurs. And you can see they come in, I mean, these things, this is such huge inspiration for creature designers. But, I kind of like, of these, I kind of like the orange to red translucent kind of look. So I'm probably going to emulate something like that. Let's see if we can find a couple other pictures here. I mean, this is a weevil. Okay, this is a weevil with Pseudo Scorpions attached. I bet you anything that the Pseudo Scorpions are just hitching a ride. They're not attacking this thing at all. And but who knows? I could be wrong. But yeah, they're really cool beasts. So I like this one because of the translucency on the legs are white, but the forearms are orange, and they tend to get darker in color as they age. I'm not exactly sure how long these things live, but probably not very long. So pretty neat stuff. And that's actually a model that I did a few years ago for another project, different Pseudo Scorpion, but that's what I'm going for. It's nice to see that appear in a Google image search. All right, so let's get to some poly painting. So what I'm going to do is I'll just pick a subtool, and I'm just going to kind of pick an arbitrary color like an orange, maybe not that. Try not to get too brown, but something in the mid-range, not too saturated. Just a very middle color that's going to be my base coat. And let me go to a more common interface. That way you guys can follow along a little bit better. All right, we can auto-save, drink a beer. Okay, so I'm going to turn on Poly Paint. I'm going to make sure my RGB is turned on, set my RGB intensity to 100, and choose Color Fill Object. So that is my base coat at 100%. Now I'm going to switch over to the paint brush, P for paintbrush, and maybe lower my Z intensity a bit, and maybe I'll pick a darker red. But I always paint in layers, just building up over time. So I'm almost like picking colors nearly at random, just throwing them on the model and squishing them around until I get what I like. That's my general approach. The other thing I like to do, and this is the reason I like ZBrush so much, or painting in ZBrush, is I'll take the smooth brush. So I'm holding the shift key. I'll turn off Z add and turn down my RGB intensity. That turns the smooth brush into a blur brush. And I think it's one of the better blur brushes that I've used, for compared to like Substance or Marmoset or something like that. The ZBrush smooth brush is the best blur. There's another setting that I like to use in here when I'm poly painting. So right now, if I hold the shift key, you can see my cursor turns blue. And so that means that's a smooth brush. So I like to have my smooth brush slightly larger than my drawing brush. So I'm going to go into the brush palette, and down here under smooth brush modifiers, I'm going to increase my alt brush size. So now when I hold the shift key, see how it gets bigger? So now my smooth brush is always a bit bigger than my drawing brush. So I just want a little bit bigger, so like 1.5 or something like that. Okay, now let's turn off perspective and turn on symmetry because I'm lazy. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start getting into masking. So this is the trick. Since I already have detail sculpted in here, I can start playing with some masking. So I'm going to go in here and turn on masking by cavity and set the intensity to like 100. And just hit the mask by cavity button. So you can see that that's the result. It's masking by cavity. And we can always play with this little curve here to kind of change the way it masks. So the lighter the gray color, the less the intense the mask is. I like this because it's sort of in the middle ground. So I'm going to invert that mask just for the heck of it, and let's hide it. So I'm going to press Control H. So the mask is still applied, it's just hidden. And now what I'll do is I'll just do color, and I'm going to fill the surface with that reddish color and maybe do a little blurring. So the mask is still applied, so I'm kind of blurring the paint that's in the masked crevices. And this is how you can get a really natural looking kind of color or a natural looking kind of detail in the poly paint, because I'm just going to be layering on one color after the other using various different masking techniques, so and some blurring. So another fun thing to play with is mask by smoothness. So if I go down here and hit mask by smoothness, I get a kind of different kind of mask, and I like this because it's highlighting those little weird little divots there. So I'm going to invert that mask again, and let's do dark red, almost black. Right, and then so now I'm going to clear the mask and just play around with blurring it a little bit. And like I said, I'm just throwing paint on the canvas almost like just willy-nilly. I never say willy-nilly, so this is a special treat tonight. I'm using old fogey jargon like willy-nilly and malarkey. There's a lot of malarkey going on here. Just playing around with that. Let's try a little mask peaks and valleys. That one's a little bit more dramatic. I'm not going to invert it. I like how this is creating little blotches here. So maybe now I'm going to hide the mask, Control H. Now let's try a yellowish color, something like this, and then I'm going to lower the RGB intensity pretty low and just hit Fill Object a few times, and maybe clear the mask and then just start. So I learned a lot of poly painting way back in the day. I was taking a class at the Noman School of Visual Effects in Hollywood, and I took a class with Madeline Spencer when she taught there, and it was a class that was only in texturing and poly painting in ZBrush. I think it was like a 5-week long class, and it was a lot of fun, because the great thing about Madeline is she had a lot of experience working on practical models at Gentle Giant. So a lot of the techniques that she was applying in ZBrush, she actually learned from people who were doing spray painting on actual models. And that's still the kind of the way that I paint right now, even though I don't do a lot of practical stuff. But it's really been helpful. So now let's get into just doing some actual painting. So I kind of have a little undercoat going here. So I'm going to go in here to color spray and choose an alpha. Just a stock alpha is fine, something like this. For this, whenever you're using the color stroke, you want to go into the options here by clicking on this and check out these options right here. So the color intensity variance is set to 0.2 by default. So if I set this all the way up to like 1, what's going to happen is it's going to, let's turn off lazy mouse. No need lazy mouse. And let's bring up the RGB intensity. So you can see I'm getting confetti out of there because this color variance slider is randomizing the color. So I usually set that to 0. So let's undo that. Bring this down a bit and lower that RGB intensity. And now just kind of start to, maybe lightly paint. And I like to, change colors while I do this. I'm not hung up on any particular hue at the moment. It's more like the overall blend that I'm most concerned with. So when I go to paint the other parts of the model, I'll just sample colors off of this thing and use that. And the color will kind of evolve as I paint it, but that's the way I want it. It's like a stew, man. It's like I'm making a stew and I'm letting the flavors blend together and create a wonderful, tasty bug soup. I'm sure these things taste just like crawfish. The other thing I like to do is, I like doing this kind of fade off over here, and then I'm doing a little bit of blurring. I might increase the RGB intensity of the smooth brush, but it might be too much. I just want to make sure that Z add and Z sub are off, so I'm not smoothing the detail that I've sculpted in there. I just want to blur the paint. And I have symmetry on, but it doesn't concern me because I like the randomness. The sculpting, the detail is mostly asymmetrical at this point, so my painting is being asymmetrical as well, which is nice. I want a certain amount of symmetry, but not too much. And then I like to leave these edges dark. Let's take a look. How do you know when the stew is done? That's actually it's actually a really good question. It's it's done when it looks right. You just keep doing it until it does look right. There's a lot of options here for the way this. Let's see if I can find a high res picture. I love. It's like I love this type of color. This kind of translucency is why I get addicted to modeling these things. That kind of stuff comes in later when I do some shading. And I've been doing a lot of stuff with Keyshot this week, so I'll probably send this over to Keyshot. But you see how this blending, it's not just uniform. We're going from deep reds and oranges to browns and blacks to yellows and even some greens. And just very slightly greenish yellows and browns in here, but you can see the beauty and the joy of this thing comes in, especially in the specular highlights. So that's always fun to play with. And sometimes, I usually, when I'm painting, I will use the Skin Shade 4 material because it's white. And sometimes I'll switch over to just flat color so I can see just the colors themselves. Let's get a little bit more orange in here. Bring up my RGB intensity a little bit. That might be too light. There we go. Something like that. Do a little blurring right there. Yeah, my texture workflow is always evolving and has changed a lot over the years. But when I started out, ZBrush was still the best way to just paint colors directly onto the model. Because, and I'm talking, this is going way, way back, you know, before we even had things like Mari. And then, you know, so I did poly painting almost exclusively and just converting that to textures and editing them in Photoshop and then applying them into a model in Maya or whatever I'm rendering in. And then I switched over to largely a Substance workflow. I use Substance Painter, which is great. But I would start out in poly paint. Start my my albedo maps, diffuse maps, using poly paint, and send that over with the model to Substance and bake out the textures and bring in the poly paint. And now most recently I'm getting into Marmoset because I like to explore different softwares. Not only does it, you know, taking the time to learn different software, not only does it expand your skill set, but it also gives you, even though I'm not a computer programmer at all, and I have a hard time with the guts of the programming, I am an artist, and getting to know the different tools and their personalities and the way they work helps you get better kind of on all of them. It's the same thing with 3D modeling. So right now I'm playing with Marmoset, and I'm really liking it. I've used it in a production already, and the baking of textures I think is superior to Substance. They just added texture painting in Marmoset, and it's pretty cool. I think it needs a couple more versions to really get it up to the level where it's as good as Substance. The one thing it doesn't have is you can't really paint across UDIMs, which is unfortunate. I mean, yeah, I think there's like a workaround that I haven't quite explored yet. So, yeah. But I'm digging Marmoset. It's pretty cool. So I guess look at this. And then, you know, what we can do is let's switch to Skin Shade 4. And I'm going to go into the material settings here real quick. And go in here to modifiers, and let's increase the specular a bit, but I think I might tighten the highlight. It's too much. Something like that. It might be a little too high. If it's too bright, then it starts to get hard to see the colors through it. And then we can go into render, and under render properties, let's turn on wax preview, go into wax modifiers, and increase the strength. That might be too much. You get kind of a sort of translucent kind of quality that way. Oh, slightly translucent. It gives you a little bit of sort of inspiration of how it might look, especially with that pumped up specular highlight. So let's see. Yes, when you poly paint, it will save out as Vertex Color data. And that's really useful when you do something like send it over to Keyshot, or I brought it into other programs. Or you can also convert the poly paint into a texture if your model has UVs, and then export the texture from ZBrush. So I've done that. I've done both. Just when you're using the FBX, make sure you're using the Z plugin FBX exporter. This plugin, as opposed to just export as an FBX, because then you can set in all kinds of options and stuff. So that's pretty cool. Let's get some darker colors in here. And the other thing I like to do is every once in a while, I'll go back in here and maybe throw on another mask. Let's see, cavity masks. I'm trying to mask by normals. Nah, it doesn't do anything for me. That's kind of nice. So I'm going to hide the, invert the mask and hide it, and then pick this darkerish color and just go over like this, and you can see you get some really cool detail there. And where it's thicker or where there are joints, I might paint a little bit more of that darker color. It's looking pretty cool. And this can also be a very fast process. Sometimes I will spend hours on it. Sometimes if I'm in a hurry and I just need to show something for a client for approval real quick, I can really dash off some nice colors on here quickly just by using some of those masking tricks. You know, these exoskeletons have pigments in them and the cells that make up them, and sometimes they're random and sometimes they're less random. I always find that kind of interesting, because if you're looking at any kind of insect or arachnid that has a specific pattern on its exoskeleton, it's always fascinating to me how symmetrical those patterns could be. Sometimes they're perfectly symmetrical, and sometimes they're totally symmetrical across all the organisms in the species, which is also fascinating. And sometimes they're a bit more random. This is probably kind of like the kind of detailing I'm doing here is kind of like more just of a randomness created by, you know, how it molts and goes from one exoskeleton to the next. So I'm going to pick a lighter color here, and I'm going to lower the RGB intensity to like 5. Let's clear the mask. Another thing I like to do is I'll switch over to like a alpha like this one. Let's increase the RGB intensity and try to create, yeah, it's too much, this randomized kind of speckling on top. So it's like by layering dark upon light and light upon dark, you can actually create the look of a subsurface. If I could turn off wax preview. Whoops. You can almost start to create a subsurface kind of look by layering sharp detail on blurry detail, light colors on top of dark colors, and mixing those. It starts to give the impression like you're actually building up layers of color. There are layers of cells making up the structure. And if you can build in that kind of subsurface look just in the albedo, then when you actually apply this to a model and render it in another rendering engine, it looks that much more translucent, that much more realistic. And then you can, you know, plug the same map with some, you know, into a translucency channel and do some color correction on it, and you get some cool stuff going that way. I do spend a lot of time looking at pictures and trying in my mind to deconstruct how the colors are working together to create a various effect, how they fade and blend together. And the other thing that's interesting is, what's the other thing that's interesting? Oh yeah, I was going to say, whoops, I don't go to your photo stream. When you're looking at insects and arachnids, here's a good example. Maybe this picture. No, it's too small. This is not a hard and fast rule, but pay attention to the way the colors change, especially near the joints and extremities of the organism. This one's a bit older because it's a darker color, but the abdomen, it's obvious, is a very bright pattern there. Here's a good example. Probably didn't want to do that. I don't know what ActiveJS is. I just want to look at pictures, guys. I don't want your freaky weird scripts. Nikki Bay. So I actually know this photographer. He's an amazing photographer. But see where it gets darker in the joints right here and here, the ends, and you have lighter colors in the middle, which creates that sort of look of translucency and the kind of almost a glowing quality. It's a really neat quality, but you also notice how it's dark here. There's always kind of a change of color in the segments of arthropods. And this one, by the way, you see it's hitched on to this beetle here. And that's really an important detail to keep in mind when you're, here's another, I mean, you can see right here in the legs, right here. You see there's darkness there in those joints? It's either going to be dark at the joints and light in the middle, or the opposite. There's just something weird about the way arthropods draw attention to their joints. I don't think it's an intentional thing, but I think it has something to do with just the properties of the ways that they age. This, by the way, is like, I think Pseudo Scorpions are actually beneficial. So when it says like got pests, and Pseudo Scorpions are not pests, man. They're your friend. As far as I know. A great example here. So when you're doing your own creature design and you want to do an arthropod or an insect or something like that, pay very close attention to the colors on the joints versus the mid segments of the appendages. Okay, I think I might have beaten that dead horse a bit too much. So let's go back to this and maybe leave this where it is for now. And maybe let's go on to working on, say, another part. So let's turn off the solo button. And let's do these. Show the. This one's really wild because I mean it's an arachnid, and these are kind of more like pedipalps than chelicerae. I mean, I think it's just, look at this. It's just wild, man. Nature's wonderful. Let's see, I'm going to, so I'm hovering over this and just pressing C to sample that color. So you can see now it's sampled. And I'm going to my subtools here. I'm going to hold shift and turn this off. And then, so I'm just looking at these two parts. So I could just sample my colors from here and just bring them over here. I don't care if they're slightly different. In fact, I kind of like that. But let's go in here and set my RGB intensity to 100, choose color. Fill object, lower my RGB intensity. Let's do cavity mask. It's kind of giving me I mean, I like this. It's like a slot machine. You never know exactly what you're going to get. You just kind of roll the dice. Well, okay, I'm mixing casino metaphors there, but roll the dice on the slot machine and put it all on black and let it ride, and you never know what you get. Hide that and press C to sample this color and choose color, fill object. Let's do it a couple more times. It's a little bit wimpy. There we go. I'm gonna clear that mask. Go down here. Let's do mask by smoothness. That one gets some nice dots, so I'm gonna make this really dark. And mask by peaks and valleys. I'm going to pick a lighter color, lower the RGB intensity and choose color. Held that a few times. There we go. So let's pick a lighter color here and go back to that other alpha. Do a little smoothing to blur out these colors. I think these parts are perfectly symmetrical, so being lazy here. But I usually do everything perfectly symmetrical just to get it done quickly, and then I'll go back and add some asymmetry in the details and in the poly paint. If I have time. Sometimes these things have to be, I mean, I think when I was working on this project, I had to pump out something like at least one model a day, if not sometimes 2 models a day. So it was a lot of models, and I had to work very quickly. Some of them did take many more days, much more time than that. And some of them, they also had to go through review by scientists to give them the thumbs up. And I don't know if you've ever gone through that process, but it's probably the exact opposite of the kind of process you go through in Hollywood. So that's the weird thing, is like I have to deal with both types of clients. Sometimes I'm working for producers and directors that are doing entertainment industry stuff, and then sometimes I'm doing stuff for scientists, and every once in a while I'll do something that's almost in between. But the working methods are very different. Science moves very, very slowly, so sometimes they take forever to get back to you. And then what you get in terms of feedback is just a link to a scientific paper, which is always fun to read when you're in a tight deadline and it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes it's like chicken scratch on a note, on a post-it note from someone who can't draw, and they're trying to tell you something about a very specific part of an obscure insect which has no photographic reference, and you're like, dude, that's a squiggly line, man. I can't model a squiggly line in 3D or it's going to look like a squiggly line. And sometimes you get some really engaged scientists who are very visual in thinking, and also artists themselves. If they're an artist themselves, that makes it easier. They could be pickier, but pickiness is not a bad thing. Picky is usually a good thing, because that's what ensures that your models are right and look good and get across whatever message you're trying to get across. This is a good example of where I like to do darkness here towards the darkness towards these little wands of death towards the end, because that really that adds so much freaking drama right there. Look at that. It's hard to ignore those horrific pinchers coming at you. And it's just by making these ends really, really dark. And then of course parts where they kind of join up with the body I'll make dark as well, because again, if you use a translucent material, that can really look nice. But I don't want to overdo it because I'm starting to lose what I think is cool. So I'm going to go up here and sample this color, and let's go back to masking by cavity, do another mask by cavity just for fun. I'm going to hide the mask. Control H hides the mask. I always do that so that I can see the colors unobstructed. But yeah, this is the kind of stuff I like, when it's like blurring it, going over a few times, and then blurring the detail with that mask still applied. Kind of lost my little black dots, but I can bring it back. Another person that I did take some classes with way back in the day at Noman was Neville Page, and I like his approach because he does try to justify everything. It's like you might argue with what his reasoning is, but he always has a reason for doing something that's usually based in science, and that's something I really appreciate about his stuff. And he's a fun person to take a class from. When I took a class from him, he was working on a super secret project that turned out to be Avatar, so that's how long ago that was. It's looking pretty good. Let's do a lighter color and bring back that little dot, and I'm going to clear the mask and bring up my RGB intensity and just do a little salt and pepper on top. The secret of doing this stuff fast is the masking. It's all about the masking. Let's do this. I'm going to go back to mask by peaks and valleys. Actually, no, let's do mask by smoothness. I'm going to hide the mask. Pick a dark color now. Go back to this. And just kind of hit these. Whoops. Invert the mask. Hide the mask. Do that, that. Okay, that part is done, I think. So what do we do now? We save. Indohyia Damocles is the species. It's polypaint. And let's go in here. And this part. Look at that thing. That's just crazy. This is where these things tend to depart from looking like scorpions. My camera's not even facing me. There we go. By the way, when I work in my studio, I have the ultimate judge of my work sitting above me. So that's this guy right here. He's always letting me know that I gotta keep it real for scorpions, man. Who will sing for the Scorpions? Well, I guess the band the Scorpions. But other than them, who will sing for the Scorpions? Might be nice to do a new wave band, like a synth pop 80s band that does only Scorpions covers and call them the Pseudo Scorpions. I'm gonna get on that, I think. This is a Pseudo Scorpion. It is a fairly common arachnid. You probably got a bunch not far from you right now. They're completely harmless, and they're extremely small, but they're very cool. Okay, so we have this. I think that's a little bit too saturated, so I'm gonna go over here. It doesn't really matter. So that's cool. And then this is a lot of rinse and repeat. So if you missed what I did the first time, I'm gonna do it 100 more times. So let's do masking. Mask by cavity. Get that profile a little bit more. I'm going to bring in some of this deep orange in here. I'm going to clear that mask, and let's do mask by AO is pretty cool. It just takes too long. I don't have patience for it. I do like the new AO masking though that they have. That's really cool. So let's do this. Let's hide this. I think this is going to be mostly dark. Something like that. I need to bring in some of that redness. Let's do a mask by peaks and valleys. And invert that mask. No. Yes. Let's hide the mask. And I'm going to pick that dark reddish color. Yeah, that's probably too much, but that's okay. C to pick the color, and then I'm going to get these kind of similar at the border between these two subtools. And then I'm actually going to get some really dark stuff going here towards the ends of these. Around here, these are the joints where the giant claws come out, so I like to keep those nice and dark. And then in here, that's looking pretty good. And then let's pick a lighter color. Let's go back. I think that is fine. Lower the RGB intensity. I'm going to smooth this out a little bit, give it a little blur, and then go over it again with this lighter color to kind of bring out, give this a look of some volume. Okay, that RGB intensity is too low. Do they exist in Florida? I believe they do. It depends on the species. I think they're pretty much everywhere. But I've never seen one in the wild, but I haven't spent enough time looking for them. I think if you have near a lot of bark and wood and that kind of stuff, you can find them on trees. Like I say, they like to hitchhike on other flying insects. So, but I haven't done a hunt for, I've done a hunt for real scorpions, and I've found a few of those, and that's always fun. Sorry, real scorpions, I mean, you know, scorpions. But I haven't spent enough time looking for pseudo scorpions, but I have some friends who do. Some cool footage out of it online. If you search YouTube for pseudo scorpions, you'll see some cool footage. Let's go back to doing a lighter color. Let's do this lighter yellow, and I'm going to go back to this little dot here. This is probably going to be completely hidden by the other parts of the model, which is probably why it's not, doesn't have a whole lot of detail on it right now, but I'm going to paint it anyways. So I like this, bringing in just a little bit of lightness, almost to create like almost like an inner glow or something like that. It really highlights the forms too. I mean, it's kind of hard to ignore these forms when you're using the color to bring them out. All right, let's do a little bit more up here. This dot pattern, and blow, just every once in a while I'm hitting it with a blur brush to smooth it out, blend it together. I'm liking that. Let's say that. Oops. Yeah, we were actually discussing that. If you don't have UVs, you're going to have to export a high polygon version of the model as an FBX. I can't say for sure if 3ds Max would import that information, but other applications will. So for example, if you bring it into Polypaint, or actually let's do a quick demonstration since you asked. We'll send this to Keyshot, and so I only have I only have this part of the model painted so far, and this model has no UVs on it. So for example, if I go to here solo and go down here to texture map, you can see under create, this is all grayed out, so no UVs. This is one of the reasons I do like Keyshot. Keyshot, you know, it's not as robust as like Redshift or something like that, but it's so fast and easy to use that it's like, if you're not really into fiddling around endlessly with rendering, Keyshot's definitely the way to go. All right, can't get to my button. I want to go to render. I'm going to turn on where did it go? External renderer. Why can I not see it? External renderer right there. Dagnabbit. Okay. And then I'm going to go PPR. You can project Polypaint to a model with UVs. Polypaint is also exported with OBJ if you select Vertex Colors and baking. Yes, that is true. It's setting up. this is a pretty dense model, so but Keyshot can handle it. So there's a good example where it came through as polypaint data. Or it's just literally, because polypaint's literally assigning RGB values to each vertex. So that's basically how it works. So just to give you a quick example, so I'm going to go into my materials here, and I have a couple custom materials that I mean, they're nothing special, but I like to go to my scene and take this rough plastic material and apply it. All right, so now I have a rough plastic sort of semi-transparent material on here, but you can see I lost my polypaint, right? And what I can do is go into the material editor here in Keyshot, double click on this, and I'm going to open up the material graph. And Keyshot has this material graph that's not unlike what you find in a lot of other rendering software, right? So I'm going to right click and use textures and find the one called Vertex Color. And if I plug this into diffuse, there we go. We get our color. So, and that's kind of one of the reasons I like Keyshot is because sometimes I just want to get a render of the model as quickly as possible with some color on it, and I don't have time to mess with UVs and textures and all that kind of good stuff. So that's a really cool aspect of it. That's why I like polypaint. Okay, let's get out of here. Go back to ZBrush. Yeah, Vertex Color is the texture. I'm not a 3ds Max user, so I can't speak to that. I'm primarily Maya. There was a time when I was young when the 3ds Max people and the Maya people hated each other. Oh, how we hated each other. Go to SIGGRAPH and just stare at each other from across the room, snarling. It's because, you know, 3ds Max is not a real 3D program. It's just a goofy architectural thing for people who like cubes, whereas Maya is a superior piece of software designed by the gods themselves. And everything about Maya is perfect, and everything about Maya works perfectly all the time. That's the truly amazing thing about it. A lot of people don't appreciate that. Nothing ever goes wrong in Maya. So those are the old days. And then along came Autodesk and said, I'm going to buy everything. And so they bought Maya, and they bought 3ds Max, and now we have to pretend like we like each other. But in reality, we all know the truth. Do I recommend using UVs before painting? No, because the great thing about UVs in ZBrush is you could do it either way. You can paint before you do UVs, you can paint after you do UVs. The only real reason you need UVs is if you want to convert the color into texture maps or make like displacement maps. And one of the things I like about working with ZBrush is if I have UVs on my model, I suddenly need to change them. Like let's say the client has decided that they want ultra high res, and now you got to do it across like 3 or 4 UDIMs or something like that. You can export the model, bring it into Maya or whatever, change the UVs around, and then re-import the model back into your Z tool. And if you store a morph target, when you re-import, it'll import the UVs, but you'll still have all your subdivision levels and your polypaint and everything. And then you can so you can change the UVs as much as you want at any point in the process. I mean, it's a bit of a pain, you know, bringing UVs in and out, but at the very least, you know it's possible, and you don't have to freak out about potentially losing any work if the UVs need to be changed. And that happens to me quite a bit, so I'm kind of used to it. But I do recommend I almost always do UVs sooner or later. Oh, maybe I should finish this out before I do the abdomen. Oops. I thought something was missing there. Okay, let's turn off the abdomen for a moment. Color, fill object. Oops. Okay. I got a little stuff poking out here, but no one's going to see that because it's going to be behind the legs. So I'm just going to cover it up with paint. So let's do a mask by cavity. Choose a darker color. I'm going to invert that. Hide the mask and choose color. Fill object. I'm going to clear the mask and just do a little smoothing. And switch over to flat color so you can really see what's going on. I'm going to choose this color real quick. C to sample the color. Let's choose that subtool just so we don't have to see that obnoxiousness anymore. Let's go in here and there we go. That's what I want. Autodesk was the Genghis Khan of 3D software. Yes, indeed it was. But you know, they brought us together, whether we liked it or not. For animating a model, do I need new UVs? No, but you should, because sooner or later you're going to want to texture that model. And if you've already got it rigged and animated, then it becomes more of a pain to do the UVs afterwards. Because if you've rigged an animated model and you're like, oh, this is great, and client says, that's awesome, can I see what textures now, and you don't have UVs in the model, you've just created a whole lot of work for yourself. So if you're going to rig an animated model, and I believe me, not only have I learned this the hard way, I learned this the hard way like literally today, because I had a very simple model, it was a very simple animation, and I just threw it in there to get client approval, and they approved it, and they're like, now I had to create textures to the model. I'm like, God sarn it, I had to go back and create UVs for it, and it's a pain. I mean, this was not a big deal because it was super, super simple, but at the same time, I would have saved myself some headaches if I had just done the UVs before doing the animation. So, you don't need UVs to do an animated model, but it's not a bad idea. You definitely need it if you're going to do any kind of like hair, like paint effects or XGen or Yeti, which a Yeti is the fur solution that I use. I don't have it installed right now on my machine, but I've been using it a lot in the past couple years, and I like it. It's a pain to install, and it's a totally different workflow, but I find it to be more stable than XGen, easier to use than XGen, and it renders really nice. And what I really like about Yeti more than anything else is the grooming tools actually work. Like a lot of these, I'm not an expert at hair. Most of the time I'm doing bug hair, which tends to be fairly short and simple. But at the same time, you know, if I want to get it to go in the direction that I need it to go, I found that Yeti is one of the few pieces of software that actually does it without me going crazy, trying to figure out why it won't go the direction I want it to. But it does require some learning because it is kind of different from a lot of other software. I don't know why I'm spending so much time on the bottom here. This is never going to be seen. There we go. Something like that's fine. But I think the color has departed a little bit too much from the rest of the model. So I'm going to sample some of this orange in here. Smooth some of this out. That's looking pretty good. I think the other thing I need to do is do some more of this masking. Doing UVs is a lot like doing taxes. It's not fun, but you should do it. And I tend to use, what I do is I cheat. I use the UV master in ZBrush to quickly make UV shells based on polygroups. This is something I actually demonstrated last time I was doing it streaming. And then I'll take the model into Maya. You can do any 3D program that has UV tools. And I spend some time laying them out, editing them, and then bring it back into ZBrush. The other thing I like to do is, just in terms of a best practice, is I always make sure that my final version of the model in ZBrush is completely in agreement with my model in Maya. In other words, the UV is the same, the subtools have the same names. It makes things a lot easier down the road, because there's some times where I've made a model and literally haven't touched it in years, and then for some reason I'll need to use it again. So if my model is nice and organized and my ZBrush tool is organized, it makes my life a lot easier. It also means that if somebody comes along and says, hey, I want to buy that model, you could just sell it to them because it's already prepped. It's got UVs and everything. And I've done that a few times, and that's always nice. I don't sell my models very often, though. I recently bought KeyShot. You recommend texturing hair and painting in KeyShot or ZBrush for animating a character? Okay. Well, KeyShot doesn't actually have any real texturing tools. It has shading tools. It has shading and lighting. The animation tools are okay. They're somewhat rudimentary. They're great for doing turntables and simple stuff like that. I would do the painting and the fiber mesh hair in ZBrush and then send it over to KeyShot. The only kind of animation I've ever done in KeyShot has been like simple camera stuff like turntables and things like that. I haven't brought in an actual, animated character. I haven't actually tried to animate an object in KeyShot. What I usually use for animation is Maya. Of course, Blender is a good alternative to that as well. And these days, what's really cool is that with Marmoset, you can actually bring in animated characters. So if you animate an FBX the same way you might animate it for like Unreal or something like that, and there is actually some animation tools in Marmoset as well, but it's really cool because you can bring in like a cycle. I mean, Marmoset is really designed for game designers, so it's kind of nice to be able to see your as you're working on the shaders and textures, you can see an animated version of it. But there might be some tools lurking in KeyShot that I don't know, because I really use it just for knocking out really quick renders. And they're always adding stuff to these tools. My other big rendering engine that I use, my favorite is actually Redshift. Arnold's okay. I've used Arnold in a few productions. I haven't used V-Ray in a while, but V-Ray is also really nice. But I really like Redshift quite a bit. And also Redshift works really well with the Eddy and the ZBrush and my workflow that way. So looking really pretty. What do you think? Found this on the end of your tongue. Would you be excited? Let's turn on all the subtools just to kind of get an idea of where we're at. Because this might be too light in color. I don't know. Have to see how it looks in the shader. Can I import fiber mesh character in Blender for animation? I don't know the answer to that because I don't use I've only used Blender a little bit, but I will say that when it comes to something like Maya, which would be analogous to using Blender, I believe you can import the fiber mesh as curves, or you can import it as polygons. The problem is if the character is animated, how are you going to get the fiber mesh to stick to the character as it moves around? So I know that there are scripts that people have developed for these kinds of things. I've never used them. I know that people have used like a wrap deformer in Maya so that they can attach like the ends of the hair to the surface. To me, that sounds like a friggin' nightmare because of the amount of calculations that Maya would have to go through in order to have the hair go along. So that's why I use Yeti. The other thing that I use for Maya users, I use Paint Effects has been my go-to for many, many years. Again, Paint Effects is great for things like bug hair. I don't know that you'd want to use it for like a character's hair. Let's take a look at some reference here for the abdomen. There's a lot of choices in the abdomen here, color-wise. I think I do like the stripiness right here. So it looks like basically, there's so much variety. It depends on how they're photographed, the species, and that kind of stuff. But overall, what I'm seeing, here's one that actually has a pattern on it. Right? That's kind of interesting. That's a very different abdomen than the one I'm working with. So, I mean, these things are fairly diverse. There's a lot of them, different ones out here. But this is the one that I like. So, bright orange for basically the goo of the abdomen, and then dark reds and browns for the tergites, which are these plates that sit on top of the abdomen. So this one, the abdomen is not as swollen as this guy. Why these things swell the way they do, I don't know. It depends. Maybe it's full. Maybe it's pregnant. I don't know. But they're fairly flexible. So sometimes you see them puffed up and sometimes you see them fairly flat. Like that one's kind of flat. I think mine might be too flat though. Nikki's picture though. They are kind of overlapping here. And there's a subtle lightness in between and then some darkness on here. And you have this kind of ribbed pattern, which I think is kind of neat. But I also like the higher contrast to the other ones. So I'll do something in between because it just seems like there's enough variety in here that you can't really blame me for kind of taking some creative license. This is the kind of thing that I'm thinking. Let's do that. So I do already have this color on here. So let's make a lighter color. Because the other thing I've noticed with these guys is that there are color changes between the abdomen and the rest of the body. In other words, it's not... Just because this is red and brown doesn't mean I can't wander away or stray from that color scheme for the abdomen. So I'm going to paint a little bit of yellow. Oops, let's turn on symmetry. Be nice and lazy. Just get a little coat of yellow on there. Happy clouds. And down here. So the way I sculpted this, since this was for print, you see how the tergites are actually just really sculpted directly into the abdomen surface. If I was going to do this for animation, I would set this up so that these are actually separate plates, separate geometry for the tergites and the interior of the abdomen. It tends to look better that way. And also it's cool when you animate it, when you set it up to rig, and you can actually see the movements of those tergites as the abdomen moves. If you can have them sliding or at the very least interacting, that's a really compelling and realistic way to do it. But again, since this model was originally done for print, we chose to go this way. I would like to have more separation, I think, between these. And maybe at some point I'll do a version that has more separation in between each of the tergites. But this is kind of similar to how fly abdomens work. Fly abdomens tend to be more flexible than, say, well, it depends on the ant. Or like a beetle. I don't know. There's a lot of diversity. It's all cool. If you look at wasps, they tend to have more rigid abdomens. But again, there's such a massive diversity of wasps that it's hard to make generalizations. So, boring bug fact for the night. Oh, I know, tonight's full of them. For many, many years, beetles were thought to be the most diverse of the insects. So Coleoptera, the order Coleoptera, was the most diverse. In other words, the most number of species. There's estimated some 400,000 known species of beetles, right? Which is a fact that I never get tired of repeating. But as recently they've discovered, with wasps, there are several classes of wasps, and there's a large class of wasps that are parasites. They're known as parasitoid. Because they often, sometimes they kill their host, or sometimes they're straight up parasites and they just live off the host. But they realized recently that for every single species of beetle, there is a species of parasitoid wasp that specializes in just that species of beetle. So that means that if you discount all the other wasp species, like the ones that we're most familiar with, that we see in our garden and stuff, and just count those species that are parasitoid on just beetles, then that means there's already as many species of wasps as there are beetles. But then on top of that, you also have social wasps and non-parasitoid wasps and non-parasites. So wasps seem to be winning right now in terms of their diversity. There's your fun fact for tonight. You can annoy your relatives with that. Next time the conversation becomes uncomfortable, say to your crazy uncle as he's hurling shot glasses at the wall, "Hey uncle, did you know that wasps are actually much more diverse than beetles?" And chances are your uncle will calm down, put the shot glasses down, have a nice glass of milk, and say, "I did not know that. Please tell me more." And then you're going to be out of wasp facts, because that was the only wasp fact that you learned, and you're going to be sorry. So what I recommend is that you go out as soon as possible and buy as many books as you can about wasps and read all of them, because your future depends upon it. How do you make hair on bugs? Okay. Oh, you actually want me to talk about something interesting. How do I make hair on bugs? Okay, the way that I do it, I have several methods of doing it. I don't use fiber mesh so much because when I get to the stage of doing hair, I generally am going to rig and animate it for animation. I could do fiber mesh in ZBrush, but I find fiber mesh difficult to work with. So the two methods that I've used, or that I prefer, are both Maya based. One is to use Maya's Paint Effects. And Paint Effects has been around in part of Maya for a really long time. It's kind of a clunky tool. It's not perfect by a long shot, and it takes a while to master. But the nice thing about it is you can convert the Paint Effects hairs into polygons and then apply shaders. So if you're rendering with Arnold or something like that. It works pretty well. The problem is if you have a lot of difference in colors of the hairs, then that gets to be a little bit more difficult to deal with. You almost have to make a different shader for each different color of hair, and different strokes for each different color hair. But for something like a spider that might not be so dense, some spiders are less dense hair than others, it works pretty well. The other method is that I use Yeti, and that takes a while to learn. but it always looks good once you do learn it. And it's very reliable and pretty stable, and works with animation pretty well. It's only recently become available outside of Europe. There were some patent issues for many years about, and you couldn't get Yeti legally in the United States. But then that changed in like 2019, I think. Some the patent expired or whatever, some kind of legal stuff, and then you could get it. So I immediately bought it and tried it. I don't have it installed on this machine, but I need to renew my license. But I did do a Gnomon Workshop video series on a jumping spider, modeling in ZBrush, poly painting in ZBrush, and I did the hair in Yeti, and all the rendering and shading in Redshift for Maya. So if that's something you're interested in, check it out. It's on the Gnomon Workshop. It's the same thing I use for my login here on this live stream, little Phidippus spider. But I've also, I've done like bees before with paint effects. I know that Blender has some really nice hair tools. I've seen some people doing some really cool renders with some nice hair, and I haven't had a chance to play with any of the hair tools in Blender, so that's worth checking out, because some of the stuff I've seen is looking as good as a lot of the stuff I've seen using other methods, and then it has the advantage of Blender being free. I don't know if the hair plugin is free, but I guess I haven't used it, so that's worth checking out. I think there's the hair tools in Unreal are getting better and better, and that's kind of where I'm trying to head. I keep having to do jobs for clients that involve rendering in Marnold or Redshift or whatever, but when I get free moment, I'm trying to up my rendering skills in Unreal, because that's where the future is. And I'm really enjoying Unreal 5. It crashes a whole lot, but with what I've played with it, the few times I've played with it over the past few weeks, I found it to be much more like a 3D program like Maya than the previous versions of Unreal. The previous versions of Unreal felt very foreign to me because of the interface, but it seems like now it's starting to feel more like a 3D program. And the rendering really does look nice. It's cool. It's fun to play with. I'm working on a little macro photography scene with some mushrooms and simple mushrooms. And then I use a lot of Quixel Megascans. I think Quixel Megascans, I really love the tools and the integration, and Quixel Mixer I think is really great. I'm a little disappointed because I actually do like modeling things like rocks and flowers and grass and leaves and stuff. Like I get off on that stuff, but there's no need to now, except if I'm doing a real close-up on a plant. And then what I'll usually do is see if I can find it on Quixel Megascans, and then see if I can up-res it through ZBrush and other means. But Quixel Megascans is really cool. And if you're interested in doing hair particles come stock with Blender, okay, that's good to know. I need to check that out at some point, because I've seen some cool stuff. Let's see how this is looking. Just gotta get some orange in there. And switch over to this alpha. Oh yeah, what I was going to say is, if you're interested in modeling bugs, and don't know where to begin, because I've been doing this for years and years and years, and so I understand the arthropod language, although I still have much to learn, and there's a few artists out there that are still way ahead of me. But if you're just getting into it, you're interested, because it's, especially if you're a creature designer and you're looking for ideas and inspiration, bugs are a great place to go. So where I'm going with this is, if you go on Sketchfab, there are a lot of really nice scanned data available for free. You know, there's models that you have to pay for, but there's also free ones available. So check those out, because that's a great place to start. Just spending some time, like on the job I did these models for originally, I had some had scanned data, some had nothing, just to begin with. But taking some scan data into ZBrush, cleaning it up, making it symmetrical, separating it into parts, and doing that is a great way to learn insect anatomy. You know, do it with some reference nearby as well, so you have a guide. But there's like great beetles on there and all kinds of good stuff. It's probably good to do one that doesn't have transparent wings, because those don't always scan so well. But like, there's some nice beetle models, and they're totally free. So bring that into ZBrush and just spend, you know, some time, however much time you think you want to do, cleaning that scan data. And then what you end up with, of course, is a knowledge of at least beetle anatomy or insect anatomy, but also a really nice model that you can then use. Because I have my library over the past 10 years of insects. It started out very small, as you can imagine, literally. But now I actually have quite a few models in there, and it's becoming really nice to have those models on hand when a job comes along that requires a nice spider or an ant or something like that, and I have really high quality models. Either I can use the model outright if it's the appropriate species, or I can use it as a starting place. I don't have to start from scratch. So I recently had to do a spider. I did not, I mean, I kind of rebuilt it anyways from scratch, just because I wanted to get it right. But it didn't take me very long to do, because I've done a bunch of spiders, and I had a bunch of spiders, and had a spider rig, so I had a lot of stuff to start with. It's getting a little oranger now. Kind of getting the effect that I like. I don't do gloves. Okay, let's do a little masking here. See what wonderful things we can come up with. That's nice. Invert the mask. Hide it. Let's choose a really dark red. Oh, nice. Sample from our friend here. C to sample the color. And just kind of hit the fill object button a few times just to dial in that color. Nice little blotches there. Okay, so for this one, I'm going to bring back some of the yellow. Just a little chaos in there, yeah. How many hours do I work each day? Depends on the job. 10 hours a day or something like that is pretty normal for me. But my main hobby is doing this as well. So I will work on stuff for clients, and then when I finish, I'll do stuff for myself. My own animations, my own projects. And then it's not uncommon for me to have several jobs going on at the same time, so juggling work. So sometimes I had to kind of space it out. But I usually have a lot of overlapping jobs, but usually a typical day for me is 10 hours, relaxed days, like, 6 or 8 hours, and then in crunch time, 10 to 15 hours or whatever. But I actually, I work in my studio here. I have been working at home for the past, since 2020, like most of us. But that's actually where I prefer to work. So these days, if somebody wants to hire me, my stipulation at the moment is that I work in my own studio. Because, it is actually beneficial for them, because I'm paying for my hardware and my software licenses and all that kind of stuff. And that's the way I prefer to work. I think some people that have worked with me in various studios feel like I can be a pain in the ass sometimes. And they're probably right. I can't stand meetings. Can't take them. Alright, I think I've done enough in the abdomen. This came out a little bit different than I expected. I think I need some of this yellow in here. It's gotten too dark. At the very least, I could maybe do something like this. I don't mind that it's a different color, because we've seen that in some of the reference imageries, but you still have to bring in a little hint of the other parts of the model, even if it's just like down here in this sort of center line kind of thing. Otherwise, it just looks like it's way too out of left field. That's a baseball analogy. I never use baseball analogies. How to find remote work from studios. That's the trick, isn't it? I have been working here in Los Angeles since 2005. So I've worked with a lot of people and have had some really good jobs with a lot of good people. And when you do that, they tend to hire you over and over again. There's a phrase in Hollywood that says, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And it sounds like a very cynical thing to say, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Because if you had an animation job that you're doing for some client that's bringing your studio in a lot of money, last thing you want to do is take a gamble on talent that you don't know how good they are, you don't know how reliable they are, you don't know what they are what they're like to work with. So the first thing a studio is going to do is they've got a shot, they've got a job, they have a client. Whoever has acquired the particular job is going to go to their producer and says, we need a modeler, we need an animator, we need somebody who can rig, we need somebody who can light and shade. And so they list all the people that they need. And the first thing that they do, the producer does, before they do anything else, is they go to the artists who are working in the studio and they say, hey, who do you know that's good at rigging? And that's how you get jobs, unfortunately, because it's so you have to build relationships and you have to network and you have to not be a pain in the ass to work with. Even when you want to be, you can't burn bridges. And you've got to be professional at all times, because you never know that the person that you're working with, even if they seem like a total jerk and driving you crazy, that's somebody who's going to be working at a studio someday. And when a producer comes along and says, we need a good ZBrush artist, if your name comes up and that person says, don't hire them, they're a jerk, you're not going to get that job. And that's where the conversation is going to end. So it's very important to build relationships. So this is an extremely long answer to your question, but it's the actual truth. Is you gotta first pay your dues by getting some jobs, probably some jobs that are not so much fun and not very glamorous. You got to build relationships with those people. And that's where your future work is going to come from. And it takes a while It can take a few years to get to the point where you can be good enough and know enough people to say, I'm working in my own studio, and make demands like that. It took me many, many, many years. It took me many, many years to get enough money to actually afford my own studio as well. That did not happen overnight. So that's the answer to the question. So finding remote work now is a little bit easier thanks to our friend COVID. But for me, it took a long time to get. And there are still some jobs where they're like, no, you can't do remote work. You have to come into the studio. Sometimes it's just basically a security issue. You know, if you're working in a job and it's a company for like Disney, they are extremely secretive, as most big studios are, with their information, because all it takes is somebody to leak some stuff out on the internet and the movie's ruined, right? So for that reason, you might have to work in a studio and you can't work remotely, because they actually literally have security methods to make sure that assets aren't leaving the building or information is not leaving the building. And when I worked at Bad Robot, and that was a fun place to work, I thoroughly enjoyed it. There was no way you were getting a file off of your computer. Do I also create sea creatures? I love doing sea creatures. I have done, I've done some sea dragons recently. I've done some various fish. I've done some sharks. I love doing octopus, any kind of mollusk. I don't do them as often. I mean, if you do a crab or a lobster, it's a lot like doing one of these guys. It's almost the same shape language. But I like doing all kinds of creatures. I like doing creatures more than I like doing people. I've done characters before, and I could do an okay character. If I really put my mind to it, I could probably do some really nice characters. But there's so many people doing characters now that it's like, I'd rather do something different than not everybody's doing. And I also, if I do a character for a personal project, honestly, I don't even care if it's a sexy woman. After a while, I get bored pretty quickly. I like to discover weird shapes like this funkiness, and I like to do things that actually exist in the real world. Although I like to do, every once in a while, I'll do my own creatures. As you can imagine, if I needed to do an insect creature right now, or a spider creature, it wouldn't be too hard for me to do. I did a few years ago, and now I don't like them because I know everything that's wrong with them. I could see all the problems. I'm like, oh, what was I thinking? I think the first few bugs I did were just god-awful, and especially ants. I tried to design my own ant. I modeled 2 ants, and I considered myself instantly an expert on ants, which I'm not, and I wasn't. And so I'm like, well, I'm going to model my own species of ant. It is just terrible. I don't know what I was doing. It took years, but I actually read books about ants, and I know myrmecologists, not just entomologists, but people who specialize in ants. And as the great E.O. Wilson said, people ask, why are you so fascinated with ants? And the question we always answer with is, why aren't you? They're really interesting. This is a superior life form, man. They've taken over my brain. I welcome my ant overlords. I have done crabs. There's some crabs in my portfolio. I did a blue crab. I did some crabs for... did I do that? No, that was Shane. I did some work on the planetarium show. For those of you who are in Los Angeles or plan to come to Los Angeles, we did a show for the Griffith Observatory Planetarium, which is known as the Samuel Ocean Planetarium. And we worked on it from 2018 to 2020. And we finished it in January of 2020. And for you history buffs might recall that January 2020 is when the pandemic started. So we finished the job. It looks brilliant. And the first thing that happened is they closed the planetarium for 2 years. Or they didn't release the show. I think they started opening the planetarium, but they're showing the older show. So literally next month, they're finally showing the planetarium show. and I got to do all kinds of things for it. I mean, I can't even say because it's too much of it to be a spoiler, but it's a really cool, I'm very proud of it. It's really, really cool. I got to do landscapes of distant planets. I got to do planets. I got to do planets that were forming in supernova. I got to do creatures, bugs, microorganisms, some sea creatures. It's a very cool show. Highly recommend it. So that was another job where I just had to pump out a lot of models. But I was a generalist, so I had to do modeling, texturing, shading, lighting, rigging, animation, camera, setting up for rendering, pretty much the whole, everything up into compositing. We had some really talented compositors. The other thing was it was a cool job because everybody who worked on it was an industry veteran. In other words, since it's in LA, we had a lot of people who were working on it who'd also worked on Black Panther or The Jungle Book, or my friend G, who got me the job, I worked with him at Bad Robot on Star Trek Beyond, and so everybody there was an industry veteran. I think we had 3 or 4 people who worked on Star Trek Beyond that were there. So the quality of the animation, the quality of the CG is really, really high. It's really good stuff. So it's not just your average cheesy sort of planetarium show. I think it's really, really good. I'm biased, of course. But I was a lone bug nerd while everybody else was a space nerd. Everybody's talking about planets and galaxies, and I'm like, yeah, but what about tardigrades, man? So it was a fun show. Let's see. So I got about 15 minutes left here. So what I want to do is I want to kind of show my method for working in KeyShot. So I'm going to just leave the legs unpainted. Actually, we could just, no, doesn't really matter. I just turn everything on. Go in here, just do. I didn't even get to the Schizomid tonight. Oh well. I know there's Subtool Master. I should be able to fill all of these at once, but I'm being stupid. I don't want to. Okay. So let's say that this, for the sake of argument, that I finished painting this guy. So let's save him. Well, I'm going to be extremely biased in which animals I recommend because I'm a big fan of arthropod. So, but you can't go wrong with spiders, especially because spider anatomy across all spiders is variations on a theme. So even though the two spiders might look wildly different, they share the same forms. They're just sort of different proportions. So spiders are a good place to start with. Because also a lot of their anatomy goes across other arachnids. So this is an arachnid, and believe it or not, in some ways it's very much like a spider, right? It's got 8 legs. This would be basically the pedipalps, the claws here, even though spiders don't have these types of claws. Scorpions do. But they still have pedipalps, and they still have chelicerae right here and fangs. So this is not that far off from a spider, and also the leg anatomy is kind of similar too. And then, of course, the abdomen. Spiders don't have segmented abdomens, but really there's evidence that they did at one time deep in evolutionary history. So spiders are good to start with. And then if you want to get into insects, the two things that you would, the two insects that you should probably learn are ants and beetles. Now, ants, because they're sort of like the proto-insect, and everything is just up front, right? The head is the head, the thorax, the legs are all obvious, the abdomen is easy to understand. beetles are a little bit harder because they're much more diverse, right? And beetle forms can be wildly different from one species to the next. But since they're so common, they're a good one to learn. There's some really cool forms. I mean, you look at a beetle and you're probably not thinking that how incredible it is, but once you get into sculpting it, there's some amazing forms in there that are just blow your mind. You know, things like, you know, I'm also a big fan of, you know, I'm just going to go on and on, but spiders and ants are a good place to start. And then honeybees are a lot harder than you might think, because they have a lot of personality to them that that is hard to capture, because you also have to sculpt them and they're mostly fur. And so you have to understand how to look at a bee and see it without the fur. So look at a bee that has less fur. But they have really wild anatomy, especially their legs. Okay, so what I like to do in the key shot here is I set up with I have a material, just a plastic material that I usually start with. And I'm going to go into the material section, click on this, and go into the material graph. And like I demonstrated before, I'm going to get the Vertex Color under Textures. And that's the poly paint. I can plug it into the diffuse. Now we have that. And now we have to make some adjustments to this material to make it look a little bit better. So there's some other cool tricks you can see. You can see the kind of the specular transmission is making this look very transparent. So it might be kind of cool to see what happens if we add like an occlusion texture. So I'm going to go in here to textures and find occlusion, and I'm going to drag it over here to this plus sign, and I'm going to put it in specular transmission. So that's going to be ambient occlusion. So if I double click on this, you can see here is the ambient occlusion settings. So I can lower the radius. So yeah, you can see how that's getting a little bit more transparency in these areas right here. And I kind of like that because it's going to make it look a bit more translucent. But at the same time, it's not as transparent here. It's a little bit extreme at the moment, so I'm going to click on the unoccluded color and maybe make this, I don't know, yeah, something like that. It's kind of cool. And let's, oh, the one thing that drives me crazy about freaking Keyshot is if you choose a color with a color picker, you have to hit the OK button here. You can't just close it, because otherwise it's like, oh, I guess you didn't want that. Well, then I'll just get rid of it, and you have to redo the whole thing. So thanks a lot, Keyshot. I don't know who came up with that idea. But yeah, that's kind of the color that I want. So let's close this material graph for a little bit, and let's up the refractive index and maybe the roughness as well. And the next thing we have to do is we have to fix the lighting, because we're using this default lighting, which is terrible. I have not modeled this live streaming, but I could always do that maybe next time, because this is like actually the third or fourth Pseudo Scorpion that I've modeled, and I think they're cute as hell, so I'd be happy to model another one. Let's go to the environment, and well, if we go into lighting and choose the jewelry preset, then the lighting quality is going to be increased, and then we have like caustics and that kind of stuff. But it is a little bit slower. I'm just going to turn off caustics for the moment. So we have better lighting, but no caustics. And then let's go into environments, and then you can I just double click on these until I find what I like. I don't like that. I don't like that. I think I like the interior ones. Let's do one that's a bit more abstract. And then I'll go into environment and rotate this around a little bit. Usually with whenever you're doing lighting at this stage, the secret is to just not give up, or not to just accept things too soon. That's the problem I have, because I start working on the lighting and I immediately hate everything that I see. I'm like, oh my god, all this work, and it just sucks. And then so I'll fool around with stuff for like an hour or so, and then all of a sudden I'll figure out what it's missing. It might be as simple as like we need more specular highlights, so it could be a light position. I can go to the HDRI editor here and add a pin and create like another light and move around here, so something like that. You know, because if I'm not getting a highlight on the surface, it's going to be disappointing. Like I'm not getting the highlight that I want, so I try a couple other environments. It could also be the shader itself, but usually after a little bit of work I can find. Okay. Yeah, so I think I've gone a little bit too rough with the material. So I'll go back to the material. Let's bring the roughness down. And the refractive index like way up. So now I'm going to tune the roughness and the refractive index just a little bit. It's not scientific at all, by the way. I'm not looking up the refractive index of Pseudo Scorpions. It's going to be similar to like plastic or fingernail or something like that. Usually comes down to balancing the roughness with the refractive. And I like it kind of shiny. I want that sculpted detail to come through. There are some more complex materials in yeah, I know Blender is more sophisticated than Keyshot. There's no doubt about that. But this is good for quick and dirty renders. I've been using Maya since 1999, so in terms of lighting control, I've experienced the gamut of most of the things you can do in CG. But the nice thing about Keyshot is you can get in there and get some nice renders with just a little bit of tweaking. It's great for when you're for those who are watching who might not be familiar with rendering too much, you know. But I played with Blender and it is quite nice. I think the lights are quite good. But you know, being a Maya artist for years and years and years, it's like learning a different language. You have to like take the time to get in there and really spend it. And if somebody's paying you money to get something out quickly, you tend to go with the tools that you know. So I just need a break where I can play with Blender a little bit more, get used to it. Same with Unreal, the same thing. It's looking okay. I think it's a bit bright. So I'll go into lighting. Maybe. There's some post-production stuff here, like you can turn on bloom. I mean, too much bloom looks a little bit cheesy. But you know what's interesting is I haven't even actually done any painting on the legs, but you can see because of the translucency and that ambient occlusion node, it looks like I did paint them, but they're completely just a solid color, unlike this. When you get into this kind of translucency, of course, that's where a lot of your colors can tend to fade out a bit. So that's why I tend to make them very vibrant when I'm poly painting in ZBrush. Well, you know, if you're interested in learning Maya, the Gnomon Workshop just came out with Intro to Maya 2022 by me. So I just finished doing volume 1 of Intro to Maya 2022 for Gnomon Workshop. I'm working on volume 2 right now, which is going to include modeling and animation. And then I'll be doing volume 3, which is going to cover lighting and shading and that kind of stuff. So if you're into learning Maya, check out my thing in the Noma workshop. You just forced me to plug my own stuff, though. So how could I resist? All right, so I think I just got a couple minutes here before I finish up for tonight, and I'm really appreciate everybody listening to me ramble endlessly while sculpting weird or painting weird and obscure bugs. I'll be back in another. I think I haven't settled on a date in May for doing a live stream, but I'll probably do a couple Thursdays in May. Usually this time slot. So the next time I'm on, maybe we can do a little Pseudo Scorpion modeling. So that would be a lot of fun. But thanks for tuning in tonight. I really appreciate it. Now it's time for me to go grab a beer and step away from the computer for a little while. I'm going to save this real quick. This is projects. Let's all right, y'all. See you in a couple weeks.